All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Olka Joshi Hansen. I'm Chief Program Officers at Grantmakers for Education. And on behalf of our Executive Director, Celine Coggins, as well as other members of the EdFunders team, I want to thank you for making time today to join us for the first in our series on the future of education, on why we need to reimagine education. We are very excited that the Spencer Foundation and PDK International teamed up to invite academics and thought leaders in the education space to come together to reflect at this moment of COVID disruption, but also a moment of opportunity about the future of education and what we can build over the next 25 years. This is the first in a series that will have about 7 different conversations that go from the big picture of today's conversation on why we need to reimagine education and allow us to spend time on issues ranging from curriculum, teaching and learning, assessment, accountability, the educator workforce, and to really kind of take a moment to step back. And even as we know that educators, communities, and students are grappling with the realities and demands on the ground every day, to take an opportunity to think about how we can rebuild coming out of COVID in ways that really address the systemic inequities that we know exist in our system, and do a better job of building an education system that can prepare young people and communities for the world of tomorrow. So thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to hand over to Dr. Josh Starr, who is with PDK International, who will be the moderator today and for the rest of the series. Thanks so much, Josh.
Well, thank you, Olka, and it is great to virtually see everybody, and we're thrilled that you have joined us for the start of our series that is really meant to be a conversation. You know, I was looking at who we have coming up and who's writing for us, and it's kind of like that question that you get about, you know, who would you want to invite to a dinner party, right? And this is the sort of thing where, like, if you're having an education dinner party, who would you want to invite? So I'm thinking about the series as like just an opportunity to engage in conversation amongst people who, you know, don't always get a chance to talk to each other around this really powerful idea, which is what should the future look like, right? How do we think about the future? You know, as someone who spent so many years in practice and is now in the nonprofit world, you know, I'm struck by how funders have these really, really great theories about how things should work, and they're willing to figure it out and put money behind it and invest in it and support it. And researchers are sitting out there saying, well, we actually know what works, right? We've been able to measure the effect of the treatment, and we can see it. And then educators are saying, whoa, hold on a sec, right? Practitioners, I should say, are suddenly going, but the realities are that to make these things happen, it ain't as easy as you think it is. And rarely do we actually get the opportunity to have the conversations to say, okay, let's try to figure out how to take these great ideas and find the intersection between theory, research, and practice. So because of the support of the Spencer Foundation, of course, Grantmakers for Education, and the great work that our editor-in-chief, Raphael Heller, has done to help just corral this work into something that is accessible in print, we're able to put this forward and have conversations about these big ideas. And as Olka mentioned, we're going to have a series around, you know, based on our Kappan articles, whether it's assessment, accountability, family engagement, policy, really exciting opportunities to think about our future. So today's is our kickoff, and I'm gonna do a quick intro. We're gonna tee up the conversation, starting with what's happening in St. Paul, and then of course we will engage in some conversation with you all. And as always, you know, some really powerful ideas have been put forth in the pages of the magazine and online. And as I used to say when I was an accountability guy, you know, at best the data help you ask better questions. And I hope we come out of this and the series with really, really good questions about what we should be doing. There are no easy answers. If there's one thing we learned in the reform era in particular, there's no simple answers, but we can collectively ask better questions that I think are going to help us actually realize, you know, the possibilities that exist in our future. So with that, let me do some introductions of who is on our panel today. We have Joe Gothard, who is the superintendent of St. Paul, Minneapolis Public Schools. Joe's been superintendent for 6 years, I think, right? 5, 6 years, doing some really, really great work. We have Lennon Audrin, who is currently a PhD candidate in Arizona State University. But I first got to know Lennon when he was the National Educators Rising president. That was like 3 years ago, I think it was. But he was also, as a high schooler, teaching Latin in middle school, and now he is pursuing his PhD. Spent time in the classroom. He's also running for school board in the Phoenix High School District. We have Hirokazu Yoshikawa, who is at New York University, the Courtney Sales Ross Professor of Globalization and Education. There's no neat acronym for that, is there, Hiro? So he's just at NYU doing some really interesting work there. And then, of course, we have Naila Nazir, who's the president of the Spencer Foundation, whose support for this has enabled us to get it going. And of course, Hiro and Naila wrote the first piece that we're going to talk about today. But I actually want to get to this. I want to start by thinking about what's happening on the ground right now. And so I asked Joe to just spend, a couple minutes teeing this up, right? Because I know from my previous experience, how difficult it is to run school systems. And given what's happening now, it's even that much more difficult. So given the day-to-day realities that you're facing right now, Joe, how are you even organizing conversations about the future? Have you guys just given up on it because of what's happening right now? Or are you thinking, no, wait, there is a way to have a conversation about the future? So let's start there.
Great. Well, first of all, Josh, thank you. And thanks to all of you for being here today. I'm really honored to be part of this panel, this discussion today. And I think in order to talk about today at this very moment, I've got to back up just real quickly and just give a reminder to myself about 27 years and more of what brings us to this point. And first and foremost, as a high school student in Madison, Wisconsin in the 80s, I was 16 years old the first time I was asked, what do you want to do when you get older? And what kind of skills do you have? I think it was called the CAPS test that I took. It filled out some bubbles and it gave back, here's what you're good at, here's what you might want to do. 2/3 of my education was over at that point. And I haven't forgotten that. As a new teacher in the 90s, a biology teacher, I was part of a task force called High School of the Future. And it was great. We solved all the world's problems on poster paper, on walls, all over the place. And then No Child Left Behind hit. We forgot about all that innovation because we were so focused on test scores, the reform era. By the time I became my first superintendency in 2013 in a smaller district here in Minnesota, one comprehensive large high school, was able to take a lot of that frustration and really invoke some change around college, career readiness, and equity. We have all these wonderful opportunities with, post-secondary universities and colleges, and we've got a great business community, but who is accessing the opportunities? And it allowed us to really bring a lot of that work in-house and look more at our high school, like not this place where you get credits, but this place where you practice and learn new skills that are going to drive your future. Then I get to St. Paul Public Schools, 35,000 students, 80% students who are identified racially diverse, 125 spoken languages, 150 years of tradition, and very much a working class, hardworking community, and trying to, again, bring change with so many different interests, so many different groups, so many different needs to meet. It's proven to be really challenging. But the one thing that happened is COVID that impacted everybody the same. It closed our doors. It closed the doors to our schools. So for the first time in my career, I didn't suspend a Black student in the fourth quarter of 2020. And it took us closing our doors to achieve that outcome. So I think of that. I think of reopening those doors, and can we come back and do things the same way? That has not left me, and we've got a lot of work to do, don't get me wrong. But I think through the pandemic, and I won't go through all the good, bad, and the ugly, but what I will say is that it gave me the opportunity to say that, in an urban district, there are different ways than brick and mortar or online to learn. There are ways that our students are earning an income, supporting their families during the school day, that we have to think about as we come back and think about what our future is going to be. And I'll leave you with this at this point before we go on to another guest participant today. Data from the Minnesota demographer last week in a presentation that I heard was this. In 2026, the first baby boomer is going to be 80 years old in our state. And in 2029, the last baby boomer is going to be 65. When I heard that statistic, my stomach absolutely was filled with butterflies in terms of the workforce that we are working with right now is right before us from birth through our entire system. We are the workforce. And I think we've taken it for granted. I think we've, speaking for myself, I think we've tried to stick with this traditional credit, seat time, school schedules, defined calendar year. And I don't think we're ready for what the workforce needs are going to be of the future.
Well, so on that, it's like perfect segue, right? So Lennon actually is our future in many ways, right? As a young man who has decided, as I'm gonna, pursue education and is gonna do it now in academia, but I know he's gonna get back into the classroom at some point as well, and we'll actually be doing this work for a lot longer than the rest of us will, given your age. How are you thinking about the future, right? I mean, how are you thinking about what you've been living? I mean, I know we've been in meetings and you're wearing masks, you're on college campuses, and you've been living through it as a student, but you're also thinking about it as an educator and a researcher now. So how are you thinking about what you need to do to to reach the possibilities that have been laid out in our series?
Josh, I think it's so interesting because I ended, sort of ended my teaching career at the pivot of COVID. And so I was at Harvard teaching high school. I was young, I was 20, teaching sophomores to seniors, and just seeing the immediate shift in what everyone thought we needed during the pandemic. And I mean, as everything is in education, it's almost this pendulum swing. There were very humanist people that were talking about, we need love, we need openness, we need understanding. But then there were the people who were structuralists who were saying that, oh, wait, we need to build better structures, we need to build better systems to keep students learning, to keep students engaged. And so I think as I am resting on years of research that's existed, as I think about the future trajectory, we have to think about new ways of acting, so those structuralist components, and also interacting. And so when we think about those, that involves more than historically we've included in our education system. We talk about, I, as a teacher of color, understand the marginalization that many of my teacher of color peers, my Black teacher peers, my Indigenous teacher peers face in the workforce. And so I think as someone who comes from a teaching background into academia, my work has been examining working conditions of teachers. And so we know in Arizona, for instance, we had this teacher shortage, and we took data, and we have a book chapter out that saw that the teacher shortage in Arizona was so bad that when we looked at January 2021 compared to January 2020, there was no change in the number of vacancies in Arizona. And that was shocking, given the magnitude that everyone expected from the pandemic. But we also know that there are features of the workforce that made this, right, the flexibility of the workforce. Now that teachers could work from home, the working conditions of the workforce changed in ways that they hadn't before. And so, yes, salary in Arizona is absolutely a big issue. We fall, if not last, at the very bottom of the ranking. But primarily teachers in Arizona are reporting, and teachers across the country, teachers of color, are reporting that working conditions are important. So as we are thinking about the future, I think it's important to think about acting and how we are interacting, not only with the systems, but how we are building those systems so teachers can interact with each other in ways that they were able to do during COVID. And now that they're back into their classrooms isolated, all of those features of isolation that have been written about for years are back. And so how do we keep that momentum of collaboration between the community and schools going?
Well, and I like the way you got in the plug for your book chapter. Very sophisticated, very good. You're learning. So I'm going to go Hero and the Naila, and I want to get into the specifics of your piece. And actually, Hero, I'm going to throw you a curveball because I didn't think about this earlier. But before we think about the specific things you all wrote about that we have to consider while we are in what I am calling a sort of post-reform agenda, what would you say was wrong, and what did we get wrong, and what did we get right over the last 20 years, right? What have we learned? What are the lessons from that as you then think about, and then we'll go over to Naila about like, what should we be organized around in the future? So here, can you just like, if you think about the last 20, 25 years of the reform era, what did we get wrong and what did we get right?
So I think we do think about these kind of pendulum swings and the potential to have kind of more comprehensive models where we've gone one way or the other. So I think the important piece of No Child Left Behind and that whole era, for me, part of it was about equity in the sense that disaggregation of data was required, right, of every district in the country. This was not publicly available information. This was kind of available in selected ways to researchers or to certain districts. But I think, so there are some things that I think we got right from my little corner of research. I think data sources and the richness of data sources, national and local, has increased vastly in the last 20 years. I think we did have a pendulum swing towards, the obviously extremely valuable idea of kind of causal impact evaluations, but I think we are enriching that picture with a much richer sense of the kind of range of research methods that can be brought to bear on policy questions. So I think those are, some of the ways in which the pendulum swing, and I think towards a much broader vision of accountability. I think we'll be talking about that. What does it mean to have many more stakeholders involved in the notion of accountability in a more inclusive way? So I think that comes from focusing on certain aspects of accountability, some of which had some positive aspects, but many of which didn't, right? And so especially if we think of it as kind of a sole way to achieve reform. So we are in this exciting moment of kind of possibility and opening up, not shutting down all the prior avenues, but opening up new avenues. And that's what this article was about.
So let's get into it.
I also want to just mention that Megan Bang was our third author.
I appreciate that.
Fantastic. It was so much fun to work with both of them.
Yes, that is great. Now everyone just, go to the website, get the article, and you'll see all the great citations and some of the responses. So Naila, talk about the four shifts. And if you can lay those out, and I'm going to do my follow-up question as a preview, right? Which is, there's a rate of change here that we have to consider. And I'm curious about not only what you all laid out in the article and the shifts, but then what should a reasonable expectation be for a rate of change? And you, who's been a great partner and supporter and investor and funder, like, how do you think about that? How should we think about rate of change as you think about what these shifts should be? I hope that was a clear question.
Yeah, I got it. I don't know if I have a clear answer, but the question was clear. So thank you for that. We argue in the piece, and of course I was looking back at it like, wow, this feels, I don't know if I'm quite as hopeful as I was when we wrote it. I still feel like this is a moment. It's such a transformative moment. But I think since September, when the piece came out, and now we're seeing even more of the impacts on school systems and teachers and school leaders in ways that I think underscore the importance of change in this moment, but give me a little bit of worry about whether we're prepared to lean into that change and what that might look like. We argue in the piece there are four kind of critical aspects of this moment, and people have written about kind of the pandemic as portal, like this opening for change, this opening to think about things differently. We argue that there's been an evolution post George Floyd in 2020, an evolution in public attitudes about race, about equity, about the goals and intentions of our society in a way that has brought those concerns really front and center. Of course, since then, we've seen all the controversy around critical race theory and the backlash and just the political heat and of that is quite concerning in a number of ways. But even so, we are talking about these issues of race and equity in ways, and they are front and center in ways that they have not been. We talked about this being a moment in education policy, as both Hiro and Lennon talk about. We are coming off of this standards accountability moment. And I think scholars and school districts and school leaders and teachers are trying to figure out, okay, what's next? If that wasn't the route to the type of building equitable systems that we intended it to be, where do we go next with thinking about what are the levers for equity with respect to change in education systems? And we talked about advances in education research. We know more. We know a lot about learning that we didn't know 20 years ago. We know that at its core, learning is about reaching whole people, that the emotional, that the psychological, that the sense of well-being, all of the sense of belonging, all of those things are not peripheral to the experience of learning, but are actually really core. So if we're concerned about deep and rich learning, then we have to be concerned about these other kind of social emotional factors as well. And we talked about this growing demand for ambitious teaching and learning that we actually are wanting as a system, as teachers, as school leaders, as scholars, to reach higher for what the learning outcomes are that we think about and measure. So I think all of those pieces really set the stage to say, for us to feel hopeful that we are at this moment of real potential change in our systems. And I think if I add the last 6 months onto that, I say, and we are seeing the effects if we don't change. We're seeing the effects if we just go back into the buildings, turn the lights back on, and try to figure out what to do. And I often think that those pressure moments, those moments when it feels like the dial is being turned up on the way we do things now. Some people know about me, I have a marriage metaphor for everything. But when those moments when the dial is being turned up, that what we're doing now doesn't work, and we have to consider doing something different, because we're not going to be left with an alternative, as we're seeing with some of the issues that Lennon pointed out around the teacher work conditions. So I think this is really an important moment for us. And one of the challenges I imagine and know is that the people on the ground in school systems are so overworked and overwhelmed and beleaguered right now, that how do we think about what change looks like in a moment where we're kind of just trying very hard to keep things from falling apart? So
let's drill down a little more, right, on some of these things. So, and again, your piece really frames what the entire series is about, but let's drill down this question of expectations for rate of change, because what you described in terms of what people are experiencing, sure, right, that's the reality, yet we also know we have an obligation to start doing something different and something better. And and part of the challenge too is that funders, practitioners, and researchers don't always see rate of change in the same way. So how should we think about that question? What's a reasonable expectation? Then after Naila talks, and all three of you like jump into that, because I want each of you to kind of think about what's a reasonable expectation around the rate of change here to get towards this future that we'd like to see for our kids.
I mean, it's an interesting question. I think pre-COVID, we would have said, well, this will take at least 20 to 50 years to accomplish. And then we saw that education systems changed on a dime, right, with the right incentives and the lack of choice. So I think when you say rate of change, I guess I think about a few things. One, the urgency that underscores the kinds of changes we need to make right now, that the systems as they are actually are not sustainable. So the rate of change will partly be determined by the fact that we cannot continue just pragmatically in the ways that we've been moving. The second thing I'll say about that is I think there is both rate of change and types of change. We've been thinking a lot about the combination of what it means to slightly change current systems for the better. And those slight changes matter a lot. And the difference between that and really reimagining how we think about education in this country and the types of systems we set up. The difference between the disjunction right now between the learning that happens, for instance, in families and communities, and the learning that happens inside school buildings. So much opportunity to think more fluidly about those things. It's just one example of a kind of a big kind of rethinking that we need to do. So I think we have to keep making the current systems better, which means better funding. It means creating the policies that put students and their learning and their families and their whole selves at the center. It means more humanizing experiences for people going into the teaching profession. It means lots of things. At the same time, we have to think about what is it about our model that needs to fundamentally change, not just in these kind of smaller ways. And I think both of those are maybe on different timescales. So I'll just throw that open and let other people jump in.
What do you all think? you guys are doing this from different angles. What do you think? What's a reasonable expectation for how quickly we should be able to get to this future we're envisioning?
Well, I think it, I think the question is not if, it's when and how. And I think the pandemic definitely showed us this, that public education is in a very linear pathway. We get funding from our state based on seat time, ADM, how many students are in class every day. Has nothing to do with, is it meaningful, is it relevant, and what outcomes do you get? And we also think our students are linear, grade levels. Again, they're classes. I don't mean to repeat these, but these are things I think about a lot. And our students today are not linear thinkers. I mean, when you think about the information that is thrown in their way, how they process, it isn't about facts, it's about connections. It's about deep and meaningful relationships. And why do we treat information so differently than we do human interactions? We should really look at doing things in that way. So I have pitched to our community a 12-hour school day. And when I say 12-hour school day, people are like, what are you talking about? You want students and teachers in school for 12 hours? No. I want to look at our school day differently. I want to look at 8 to noon, noon to 4, and 4 to 8, and look at different modules for learning. That could be brick and mortar. It could be online. It could be blended. It could be in the workplace. It could be the workplace coming into school, but looking at a variety of different ways that students can, in fact, get a meaningful and relevant education and a pathway to their future. And, I think the other piece is that many times we do this, except for it's for a select few, many times does not meet the targeted student groups or targeted audiences whom you want it to. And there's also that limiting piece of access. It's only for those who can get into the program. And I want to look at a way for this to become our norm, so that we can be very much connected to our community, workplace, and higher ed, and that we can do it in a more meaningful and relevant way.
Len and Hira, what do you guys think in terms of rate of change? Like how quickly what's even possible to move? I mean, I'm thinking Hira more from your perspective as a researcher, right? Like what's even, how quickly can we move? And Len and I imagine for you, you're a young guy going in this, like you're like, they haven't caught up to where we are. So like, what's a reasonable expectation for how quickly we can start making these shifts? You're both way too polite. Why don't you jump in?
Hiro, go ahead. You can go first.
Okay. Well, so I do think it's striking what Naila said about the rapidity with which education systems had to change at the beginning of COVID. And let's recall that there was an expected devastation of budgets nationwide for education systems. And at the same time, there was a response, which was a scale of investment, which was unprecedented in the American Rescue Plan and the infrastructure bill. So I do think we're in those, even though they were not, I would say solely directed to education, we need to learn much more about how those affected, the first one in particular affected education. But so that to me says something about the scale. $1 trillion was just not something that was considered in the realm of possibility for single bills. So that is something that's happened. Obviously, there's been some setbacks. The other is the power of social movements of all kinds, in person and social media, which can, of course, they arise and can have rapid negative or positive effects, right? If we think of the unprecedented ways that Americans came together post George Floyd and through Black Lives Matter, that's on the positive side. If we think of social movements that are resulting and the contributing to political polarization and to divides in the United States, that's on the negative side. But the power of social movements is something that I think we need to absolutely consider as potentially transformative in education. And then the other thing that is inexorable, which is one last kind of a piece about societal change that we mentioned as background in our article, is the pace of demographic change in the United States. And that being one that has been moving towards greater diversity for very much a long time, that you can have within that context of demographic change, certain groups, LGBTQ youth, marginalized groups that achieve certain degrees of kind of acceptance, and then, of course, opposition. But I think that the longer arc of that form of societal change is towards the diversity of the younger generation, and that can interact in powerful ways with these notions of social movements and social change.
Yeah, we're going to get into that in a minute. Lennon, you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, the one thing I'll say is I don't think I can nail down like a time frame, but as someone who is working at ASU to help build these team-based staffing models, we like to say it needs to move as fast as we can, but as slow as we must, and to add like poetry to it, at the speed of trust. And I think we have to realize that even in the pandemic, there has been growing distrust about public education, and this has caused some pivotal and profound, it has slowed us down, and so it will be and it will take time to rebuild the public trust with public education in some ways before we can move forward. And so I think as we are rebuilding, we've seen other movements where teachers have come together in Arizona, in Oklahoma, Red for Ed movements, thrust bills that help to increase teacher pay. So it won't just be, simply about, teachers putting all, again, because that's what a lot of our accountability efforts have been, is putting a lot of the weight and burden of change, equity change on teachers. But we know that when, as Hiro mentioned, people come together, these political movements come together and they have support from the community and they move at the speed of trust, that change can happen.
Yeah, I will say on this rate, Josh, we framed the series of articles with a time frame of 25 years. And we debated that hotly about how should we say 10 years because there's urgency? Do we say 50 because it'll really take a while? And we thought 25 years was a nice span where people could imagine drastic change, but still, be thinking about what the process towards that drastic change would look like. And I want to just put one more thing on the table around this, which impacts this issue of timescale, but also the why, which is that learners are different. So I think oftentimes in these situations, I have 4 kids, wide age range. My oldest daughter is 30, my youngest son is 17. And they are very different kinds of learners with very different orientations to school. And I feel like I can see, even in that span, my 30-year-old versus my 17-year-old, the different way my 17-year-old approaches school and learning. And what he will say is, he's not a fan of school right now. He's a junior in high school. He's in an excellent school in an excellent district. But he says, this isn't the way I learned. And he's a kid who during the pandemic taught himself cybersecurity, accessed all these modules online, reads books voraciously, but can't find the spaces in school that speak to who he is and how he learns. And I think that will also increasingly be the norm, where the ways we design pedagogy and teaching and learning just don't fit with these digital natives that are now, kind of coming of age in our school system.
Well, so so clearly the answer to my question was, it depends, right? There's no real answer. Okay. So I want to go to what you were saying, Naila, but I want to take it in a little bit of a different direction. So schools, American public schools have been set up to rank and sort kids forever, right? We do a really good job of otherizing and a really bad job of belonging. And in many ways, that has been the purpose of schools, to rank and sort. We know that's not good enough for so many. I mean, it's just, it doesn't serve society's purposes. It doesn't serve kids' purpose. Like, it's just wrong in so many ways, but that's how we've been structured. And so, Naila, I'm thinking about what you just said about your son, and I see it with my own kids too, as learners, just being able to attend to the individual needs of learners. But there's also this idea that we are not set up to actually be equitable, right? We're really good at ranking and sorting. So whatever we're doing in school, and we're going to be talking about this over the next 7 sessions, whether it's current structures, future structures, whatever it may be, it has to serve everybody, but getting there is really, really hard. So I guess the first question is, and I also think there's incredible urgency around that, but we don't see it in the same way. So I guess the first question is, maybe I'm going to go back to you, Naila, in this, because I want to think about funders, which is our audience here. Like, how should funders be thinking about the urgency around this issue of racial justice in our schools and how we're not set up to do that? And what should they expect? Like, how do we get somewhere different with what you laid out in your piece and kind of taking those two together? Is it? Just talk about that a little bit, and then we're going to go into some of the other aspects of that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think racial justice is both a pragmatic imperative and an ethical imperative. And I think the pragmatics are that we are already seeing drastic demographic shifts in the constitution of who attends public schools. This is the future of our nation. so that if we do not figure out how to educate everyone well and fully without denying their humanity in the process, we will fail as a nation to stay competitive, strong, robust. So I won't go down that rabbit hole. So there's a pragmatic imperative. There's also an ethical imperative, which is that we currently have school systems that routinely support the whole well-being and humanity of some students and completely disrupt the sense of whole person humanity for other students. And that is an ethical violation of some sort in my book. I think about that a lot. And I think I've written about this with my son, that when he turned 12, the world reacted to him differently. He's a Black male. And all of a sudden, this little kid was viewed as a threat wherever he went. And that impacted how teachers responded to him, how school systems responded to him, how he developed his identity in relation to those things. And so it has long been my assertion that one of the troubles with racism and one of the mechanisms of racism is actually to deny your basic human needs. That's what it does, right? And if you're denying the basic human needs of a wide swath of the student population, then you are also underdeveloping the potential gifts, skills, talents of all of those young people. And that, again, is both an ethical and a pragmatic problem for our nation.
So I want to keep talking about this issue, and I'm going to go to you, Joe, because I know you think a lot about issues of equity. I'm also just process-wise, folks, if you have questions, throw them into the chat. I'm going to try to tie one of the questions of the chat into this question for Joe. So let's see how well I can do this. But there's this question around individualization now, right? Particularly as we come back from COVID, there's a question around wanting to meet the individual needs of kids, wanting to really help them find their passions, whatever it may be. Joe, I know you're also thinking a lot about careers. That's part of the innovation you're doing. Yet we have standards, and the idea behind standards was that, wait a second, all kids should achieve high academic standards. Yet some of the conversation around innovation and imagining the possibilities is that everything should be differentiated and individualized. I have a hard time wrapping my head around how that all fits with an equity agenda, right? Because what we've done really well in this country is use that idea of differentiation to have lower level standards for some kids, I mean, non-white kids, right? We can go into the history of CT. So like, it's a hard one. So how do you, I mean, you're in St. Paul, right? Very diverse place. How do you wrap your head around that? How do you lead on that issue where you can say, yes, there are some differences, but that doesn't mean we should lower standards for our Black kids, our Latino kids, our Indigenous kids, or, and go on and on. So talk a little bit about that.
Well, one way is this. You heard me earlier say, 2/3 of my education was done before someone said, what do you want to be? What do you want to do? And I haven't forgotten that. We now have a personalized learning plan that's not uncommon to a lot of districts, but most of them start with a 4-year plan in high school. Again, planning your future. But in St. Paul Public Schools, we start in pre-kindergarten, and we use a platform on Zello that is taking an inventory of students' gifts, their leadership, how they identify themselves, how they identify the world around them. And I think school many times is a mold that children either fit in or don't. And instead, I want to look at a way that we can have a flexible, nimble model around the needs and the desires and the assets of every child. And to do that, it is a better pathway of individualizing and differentiating learning. When you know what students and families need and want, it can help you build a system that can be more relevant. And I'll also say that this isn't just on the school. To me, a personal learning plan is a contract from the community. How do we work with our community to understand who our youth of today are, our children, our babies are of today? And how can we support them to be great? We happen to have an incredible mayor, Melvin Carter, in St. Paul. And 3 years ago now, 4 years ago maybe, he began an initiative with local business community for college savings accounts. So every child born in St. Paul gets a $50 college savings account. And to me, we don't talk about that enough because, again, that is a contract from this community that says that every child born here, we need to take stock in and help raise up and prosper, not only in education, but in community as well.
Yeah, yeah. So look, I want to shift the conversation just a little bit. And again, if folks have questions, put them into the chat, please, and we'll try to get to them. But maybe, Lennon, I'll start with you on this because I know you're close to this. We think a lot about what might look different for kids, but adult practice leads to student outcomes. So talk a little bit about adult practice. Like what should we be doing different? And I'm even hearing that, Joe, in what you said, right, about this idea that if you're gonna differentiate, right, and you're gonna hold kids to high standards, you actually have to know them and do some work to get to know them, to organize. So talk a little bit about, I'll go Lennon and then Hero, like what do adults need to start doing different? And be as specific as you can around the kinds of practices that are gonna help us get to this future that we all envision.
Joe mentioned this earlier, and I think this is such an interesting point. We have an age-graded education system, and it's funny when anyone suggests anything to the contrary, they say, well, where's the research on it? Where's the research on it? And then the question is always, well, where's the research on the age-graded system? Like, we know it comes from like this, the Jesuits in Spain, and like they were organizing kids by age on rows. And so we've adopted this model and we've set it as our expectation, almost our assumption about how schools should look like. And we've started to research practices from there. And I'll hint at this because it's work that I'm working on at ASU. So Arizona State University and Carol Basile, who's the dean there, and Brent Madden had been working on something called the Next Education Workforce. And so we have for a long time predicated the schooling system on one teacher in one classroom being responsible for the needs of all the learners in that room, socio-emotional, academic, making those connections to the community. And we have seen how terrible this isolation is, not only for teachers, but also in our personal lives because of COVID. We were isolated and relegated to our houses for months, and some of us still are. And so we have seen how bad isolation can be, but we also can see, as Hero mentioned earlier, like the power of when people can collectively get together to do things that are best for kids. And so I think one of the things that we have to shift out of, one is the age-graded model, but two, it's making sure that teachers, as adults, as practitioners, as experts, who all come as well with differentiated expertise, gifts, talents, skills, and knowledge. How do they work together to meet the needs of a group of learners, as opposed to, this is my one teacher, here are your 30 students, and if one of your students, if two of your students, if 5 don't get along with you, well, that's your classroom for the year. And we've kind of just, it's randomized, it's schedules, it's part of this is all tracking as well. We mentioned equity, a lot of the tracking research would show us that tracking is inequitable for a variety of reasons, but also because it relegates students of color into these secondary schedules, because we've created tracks for AP and honor students, and then tracks who are disproportionately students of color. And so I think one of the practices that I see most promising, even from just the early research findings that we've done at ASU, has really been around what are teachers reporting, do they enjoy about collaboration? What are students reporting about stronger social networks with their teachers? And we're finding really good early results on this. And so I think one of the things that we really should be focusing on is strengthening the ways that teachers get to work with one another, like adults do in other professions, because that's where we have not gone and we have not shifted. We've tried co-teaching, we've tried collaborative planning time, but at the end of the day, a high school student, for instance, might have a math teacher A and English teacher B, but will English teacher B ever talk to math teacher A about that high school student? No, we've asked that 14-year-old to be responsible for their own learning trajectories and meeting with their 7 teachers. We haven't created networks around students. We've asked students to create their own networks. And so I think that's what we have to shift to, is figuring out how we bring adults into networks and around students, as opposed to just expecting either a high school student to develop their own network or one teacher in an elementary classroom classroom to be responsible for their group of learners.
I still get anxiety when I think about the day that I asked all my executive team and myself, we shadowed high school kids for a full day. And yeah, Lennon, you just hit it. When you that experience and what we ask kids to do is, yeah, it's a lot. Hero, adult practice. Like, what do you think of the, and let's be specific. What are the couple, 3 adult practices that can start shifting if we want to start building towards this future that you described? What should we start doing differently tomorrow? And again, if folks have questions, throw them into the chat, please.
No, I think I totally agree with Lennon that it is about relational supports. And when he started this hour by talking about the transition back from COVID as being one of back into the isolation of classrooms, that was really striking. So, so yes, I do think the approaches that we know build peer collaboration and peer-to-peer learning are really promising, like continuous quality improvement models or these kinds of approaches that can both motivate as far as like one's own career and the meaning of why you went into education in the first place, and to build models of adult learning, right, that are themselves motivating. So I'm struck by what I was going to say, well, actually about students, is that there's really interesting work by Jennifer Adair and others, that the more agency that young learners experience, which means having a say in how and what and with whom they learn, the more they help each other actually towards the collective good. And yet Black and Latinx students across many school systems that she studied simply have fewer opportunities for that kind of agency. And I think the same applies to teachers, which is if you provide the opportunity for teachers to have some say in how they learn to improve their practice, they are going to be helping each other in collaborative ways that I think some of these network-based models show can really improve both the kind of the workplace climate, reduce isolation, and build innovations in practice.
Yeah, agency is essential all around. We're not designed that way, but that's part of the system design question that we need to get to that will actually enable the changes in these practices. So what about thinking about this last year, right? I mean, people have been doing things differently, and we've been doing it in crisis, but some of these things should stay, right? Whether it's more access to remote learning, whether it's flexible scheduling, are there some things that we've been doing in the last year and a half that we say, actually, these should become the new norm because we've learned how to do it and it actually works? What do y'all think about that? And that's just open to any of you. What should stay?
And not that it's new, but we are going to have a consistent schedule across the district that is a block schedule. It is an A and B day, 8/2, or whatever you want to call it. But for a few different reasons, one that I hadn't thought of or that we hadn't thought of before. We have one Ojibwe teacher, native language teacher in our district. So only students at that school can take Ojibwe. Well, now if we have aligned schedules, we can have students from all over the district taking Ojibwe while they learn online at their school, supervised or having some, pseudo supervision. So to me, I don't know that we would have been pushed to do that had it not been for, again, distance.
It's like now it's possible, right? Like yes. Now, oh, wait a second, we actually can do this.
We have the bandwidth, we have the technology infrastructure to do it. So, we're poised to do that. I think the other thing is just the social justice movement. You mentioned George Floyd. There was a 22-year-old Black man, Amir Locke, killed by police over the last week. I'm looking frantically at my phone because we have a walkout from one of our high schools to the governor's residence tomorrow afternoon. And it is a statewide being organized by our students. Our students were pent up and we were in distance learning in that summer when George Floyd was murdered. They didn't have their time to have their say. And I think our students right now through these last 2 years, especially right here in the Twin Cities, have a lot to say and they expect and demand to be heard.
Yeah. Who else?
Yeah, I would just add to that great list. I think we should continue the reduction in reliance on standardized tests. I think pausing the SAT and the ACT for university admissions has shifted who's applying to universities and who's getting in, as well as thinking about slowing down the cadence of the standardized test cycle in K-12, I think has also given many students and families some relief from that one narrow way of being measured and assessed.
I would add the new sense, and I think we really did highlight this in the article too, that families and communities are at the center of education, and that really decentered this schools only vision of education. And so I do hope that the things like the community schools movement, or these aspects, higher education institutions paying attention to the poverty of their among their students and to basic needs. Schools became nutrition hubs and like community multi-service hubs without being part of any community schools movement. They were simply responding to communities. So I think this broader vision of education in the context of health and nutrition. I'm from the early childhood field, so we routinely think of all these things as sectors that you have to kind of integrate and coordinate. And I think it is also part of K-12 education, but much more highlighting of the urgency of that and addressing mental health issues as being critical in the return to schooling.
We're going to get to that after Lennon gives his quick answer on what we should keep doing. And then we're probably going to end on what Hiro was talking about. Yeah.
I think two big things. We have a really big, vast amount of human capital that we don't use. Grow your own programs like Educators Rising and Community College Teacher Ed. And I think with all these pushes for high dosage tutoring, and when we know the vast amount, there are 160,000 students in education and training programs across the US. Community college students are, thousands of them getting associate degrees in education. With a little bit of training and support, can we leverage them in meaningful ways, in compensated ways, even as they explore a career in teaching to help individualize, personalize, deepen learning for students? And those already exist in communities. And one of the promising things that I saw had been a school that basically put their students as tutors, their Educators Rising students as tutors, and helping teachers to develop online resources and materials because they were digital natives and because they were able to do that. And so how can we leverage all of this human capital that wants to be teachers, that want to be in schools differently, including student teachers as well, to help really make a difference in the learning experiences that students have?
There's just so many different ways I want we only have a few minutes, and there's this sort of two-part question that Ulka raised that I've been thinking a lot about, that Hiro also kind of brought up, and that part of what I'm thinking that we have to do if we want to start actually organize around this future is think about who gets to make the decisions about it and how do we involve folks. Yet we're also seeing that sometimes decisions can be really, really problematic if they're left at the local level. It kind of is why we're in the situation we're in, but it's also what we need to get out of where we are. And our dominant sort of culture in America likes ranking and sorting, likes standardized tests, likes a lot of what we see in the current architecture of school. So how do we involve community in different ways? And by community, I mean internal and external, right? How do we involve people in this conversation differently so that we can leverage all the strengths that exist within a community, because education is still community-based, right? It's locally driven, to get towards the future that we really want. Like, what does that look like? And what have you seen maybe out there about how folks have done that kind of work? And I'll also say we're going to have a whole session on community engagement down the road, but I'd love for some of you to just talk about how you're seeing that. How do you involve people? Who wants to? Anybody can start on that.
Well, I'll jump in because it's actually what I was thinking of talking about around the last question, or what we've seen that's encouraging. For me, what comes to mind are some of the innovations in summer learning that are happening in districts across the country, but in particular in El Cajon. They started this revamping and reimagining their summer programs the summer after COVID by asking community members and families, what do you need? What do your children need? And so starting from that need and then designing from there was a fundamental aspect of their work. And I think that also aligns with this notion that whose agenda, whose needs are being met, who's driving how we're thinking about change, and that really starting from communities and families and young people is really important in this work.
I think
what about the rest? Yeah.
One of the things I've heard consistently is, top issue in the district, if you talk to just about anyone, is we want more teachers who look like us. And that could be a variety of diverse people. And, obviously that isn't going to change overnight, but the other demand was we want ethnic studies. We want a multidisciplinary class that reflects and respects our backgrounds. And it was voted on this fall to be a graduation requirement for the class of 2025. That would not have happened without our students being part of that. That would not have happened without strong voices from our community.
Others, Hero and Lennon, what do you think about like how we change who's at the table to start driving some of these decisions?
I was just going to say, and this is a little more maybe on the psychological interpersonal level, but yeah, I've been involved in a project where stakeholders in a school learn kind of deep interviewing skills and learn to interview people that they do not know in the school. And we're now making that a whole school approach. And I think it can be applied across communities too. The unfortunate thing is that we don't build those skills in youth. Interpersonal listening and curiosity and interviewing aren't actually social emotional skills that are central within that realm yet. And so we find some extraordinary bridging of divides and perceptions of having more in common with groups that are not of your race, not of your religion, not of your gender identity when we implement this program. So I think that's this idea of building youth and adult curiosity about their community and about those needs. So absolutely has to start with those kinds of skills.
Lennon, thoughts about community?
Yeah, I think we know that we're all on this call because money drives things. And I think participatory budgeting is just a big factor in that. In Phoenix Union, we're trying out participatory budgeting, and that's something that I hope to continue and expand, because we know that students and parents in the community getting to drive the way that the resources from that community are utilized in schools is powerful. And so offering opportunities for that, I think, will be essential in trying to get the community to really feel invested in seeing the changes that they want to see.
All right, this is a round robin question. It's a quick one because we only have 2 minutes left. Olga's back on to give me the hook if we don't end on time. So what's the most promising thing you've seen recently in schools that gives you hope, right? I mean, we're in this sort of time, it's dark, it's hard, but we see things that give us joy or that give us hope and say, yeah, you know what, this actually is good stuff. So tell me, like, what you've seen recently that you just say, yeah, this gives me some hope that we actually can do this, and our future is brighter than perhaps it may look today. I'll go Lennon, Joe, Hero, Naila.
Yeah. Early findings from our work in building team-based staffing models is showing that teachers have stronger team culture, stronger self-reported practices related to equity for learners, deeper learning, individualized learning practices, and that they see benefits both personally and for schools in general to implementing team-based models where they get to work with shared groups of students.
So teachers get it when they're working in teams. Got it. Joe, what are you seeing that gives you hope?
I've mentioned a lot, but I think currently it's our work around creating an environment for 3 and 4K for all students in our city. Right now we have 1,300 enrolled in 4K pre-K, which is great, but there are many, many more who we want to ensure have a great start to their education.
Yeah, great. Hero.
Something I didn't mention, which is some work in New York, parent and youth organizing in the context of the goal of abolition, but to envision a new education system, not simply like tearing down a system, but what does a new education system look like that doesn't reinforce or assume carceral systems?
All right, Naila, what's giving you hope?
What's giving me hope are 2 things. One, the use of alternative assessments, such as portfolios that are student-driven and really centered around real learning, and the data on ethnic studies courses and the new student demands for those courses. The data just are so robust about how effective these courses are on a number of dimensions.
Yeah, so what I love about what each of you said and about what you've been talking about throughout the whole time, it's like, the series is about envisioning the future and thinking about 25 years, which does sound so far away. But for those of us who were in schools 25 years ago, there were some pretty dramatic changes. And as you all are going to see in the series, as we drill down on some things, like there are some things now that we can start pulling out. And it's kind of like I say to my kids all the time, you know, what are you good at? Like, do more of that. And there are actually things that we're good at that we could do more of that will get us there, while we also paint the big pictures, you know, and the big vision for what that should look like. So I want to first, I want to thank all four of you so much for joining us in this conversation. Before I kick it over to Olka, it's really, and for everybody out there, you know, thank you for participating. We will keep this conversation going. I really feel privileged to be a part of it. And Olka, I'll turn it over to you for the last comments.
Great. Adding my thank you to the panel for doing this both and, kind of digging into the hard issues and also giving us a bit of hope in terms of the short and long term. Thank you, Josh, for moderating some really important themes. And I just want to highlight that Ed Funders is going to have our second of this series that's focusing on the goals and the scope of the curriculum. So if we think about human development, if we think about learning, then what is it that we're going to focus on? That's next Monday at 3 p.m. Eastern time. We also are going to be kicking off a series on the future of the teaching profession, which will be starting with a conversation with Arizona State University on team-based teaching, and then we will have Becky Pringle from NEA and Randy Weingarten for a conversation. So thank you all for being with us today, and have a great rest of your week.